The snow was falling so hard it looked like white static on a television screen, but I could still clearly see the silhouette of the stranger pressing my daughter-in-law against the frost-covered glass of my own living room window. I was 68 years old, standing in the freezing darkness of a Wisconsin blizzard with the winds screaming off Lake Michigan, and my hand was gripped so tightly around the heavy tire iron I had pulled from my truck that my knuckles were bleeding inside my leather gloves. They were illuminated by the golden light of the stone fireplace I had built with my own 2 hands 30 years ago. I watched this man, a man I had never seen before in my entire life, slide his hands beneath the heavy wool sweater that used to belong to my deceased wife, pulling my son's wife against his chest while she threw her head back and laughed. I stopped breathing. The cold air hit my lungs like inhaled glass, but I couldn't feel it at all because the blood rushing in my ears was deafening. Vanessa was supposed to be 2,000 miles away at a luxury real estate conference in downtown Seattle, a trip my son David had paid for by working 80-hour weeks at his architectural firm in Chicago. David had dropped their 7-year-old daughter, Mia, at my downtown condo just the night before, kissing her forehead and apologizing for having to work late again to cover the mortgage. And yet, here was his wife, exactly 40 miles down a private logging road in Door County that doesn't even exist on modern GPS, drinking my imported wine and burying her hands in the dark hair of a stranger. They moved together with a terrifying, synchronized rhythm that made my stomach violently heave into my throat. This was not a sudden mistake. This was a practiced routine. I tasted copper in my mouth. If you have ever felt the physical, crushing weight of absolute betrayal, you know that it does not start in your brain as a logical thought. It starts in your gut like a sinkhole opening up and swallowing your organs whole. I wanted to march up those wooden steps, shatter the glass sliding door with the iron bar in my hand, and drag them both out into the freezing mud until they were terrified and begging for mercy. I wanted to see the look of absolute horror on her face when she realized the monster she had awakened in the dark. I took 1 step forward. The snow crunched loudly beneath my boot. That was the mistake. The man's head snapped toward the window, his eyes scanning the absolute blackness of the tree line where I was standing, completely frozen in the shadows. He couldn't see me, but he felt the shift in the air. I held my breath until my vision began to blur at the edges, watching as Vanessa pulled him back down by his collar, whispering something against his mouth that made him smile and turn away from the glass. I forced myself to step backward, retreating into the frozen pines, my knees shaking so violently I had to lean against the rough bark of a massive oak tree just to stay on my feet. The mistake most people make when they are deeply, violently hurt is that they confuse immediate confrontation with permanent resolution. They scream, they throw things, they demand immediate answers from people who have already proven they are pathological liars. And by the time the dust settles, the liar has already hidden the money, changed the narrative, and convinced the entire world that they are the actual victim. I was not going to let that happen to my son. I was a retired forensic accountant who had spent 40 years dissecting multi-million-dollar corporate fraud, hunting down executives who thought they were smarter than the paper trail they left behind. I knew how to destroy a liar. I turned my back to the warm glow of the cabin and walked half a mile through the knee-deep snow, down the treacherous, unlit trail that led to the rocky shoreline of the lake. I found a massive limestone boulder that overlooked the back deck of the house, offering a clear, unobstructed line of sight straight through the large bay windows. I reached into my heavy winter coat and pulled out my digital camera, a professional rig with a massive telephoto lens that I normally use to photograph nesting eagles on the bluffs. I wiped the freezing condensation from the glass. I checked the battery. It was fully charged. I clicked the camera dial over to silent electronic shutter mode. I settled down into the freezing mud behind the rock. I raised the lens. I waited. Half an hour later, the glass doors slid open on their metal tracks, and the two of them walked out onto the wooden deck, wrapped in one of the heavy down blankets from the guest bedroom. They were completely oblivious to the world, laughing into the freezing wind, entirely secure in their isolated little bubble of deceit. I focused the lens directly on his face, snapping dozens of ultra-high-resolution images as he leaned down and whispered something into her ear that made her smile. I documented the exact way her hand rested with perfect, terrible familiarity against his chest. I captured the precise moment he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a velvet box, and slipped a heavy silver necklace around her throat, kissing her bare shoulder as she admired the jewelry in the moonlight. My fingers went completely numb from the freezing temperatures, stiffening into useless claws around the camera body. The wind sliced through my heavy coat, driving ice crystals deep into my skin, but I absolutely did not move a single muscle. 3 agonizing, excruciating hours passed in slow motion. Every fiber in my lower back screamed in burning protest, my knees locking up in the cold, my breath crystallizing in the air in front of my face. I stayed planted behind that rock. I have learned over a long, difficult life that the universe rarely rewards the loudest, most aggressive man in the room. The universe rewards the patient man, the man who can swallow his pride, sit quietly in the freezing mud, and calmly gather the devastating ammunition he needs to end the war with one single, deafening shot. Eventually, the cold drove them back inside, and I watched through the lens as they packed their belongings, moving around the living room, extinguishing lamps and washing wine glasses to cover their tracks. They came out the front door, and I crept through the trees to photograph his custom license plate, the VIN number clearly visible through the windshield, and the way they kissed passionately one last time before he climbed into his silver Range Rover and drove away down the dirt road. She followed 10 minutes later in her own car, completely unaware of the ghost standing in the trees watching her leave. I waited another full hour in the freezing silence before I used my spare key to unlock the front door of my own cabin. The air inside was suffocatingly warm, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and wood smoke. I walked slowly through the living room, noting the empty wine bottle perfectly placed in the recycling bin, the throw pillows perfectly fluffed, the absolute terrifying care they took to make it look like nobody had been there. I walked down the narrow hallway and stood in the doorway of the guest bedroom, the exact room where my granddaughter Mia slept every summer. The bed was perfectly made, the quilt tucked with military precision, but right there on the white pillowcase, resting inches from a framed photograph of my deceased wife holding Mia as a newborn, was a single, long, dark hair. I gripped the wooden doorframe until my knuckles turned stark white. I could not breathe. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to pour gasoline over the hardwood floors and burn the entire cabin to the ground right then and there. That was the exact moment I realized this wasn't just simple infidelity. This was a profound, malicious invasion of my family's sacred sanctuary. I turned around, walked out the door, locked it behind me, and drove 5 hours back to Chicago in absolute, terrifying silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't stop for hot coffee. I just gripped the leather steering wheel and let the cold, calculated, mechanical part of my brain take complete control of my body. First thing Monday morning, I walked past the security desk of a high-rise building in the Loop and entered the private offices of Victor Vance, a former FBI financial crimes investigator who had run corporate security for my old accounting firm. Victor was a ghost of a man, a chain-smoking cynic who could find the bottom of any ocean if you paid him enough to dive. I sat in his leather chair and slid an encrypted flash drive across the polished mahogany desk. I gave him the high-resolution photos, the license plate number, the exact timeline of events, and Vanessa's full legal name. I told him I needed everything he could legally and illegally find. He didn't ask a single question. He just nodded. 3 agonizing, torturous weeks went by in a slow drip of psychological agony. Every single Sunday evening, David and Vanessa came over to my downtown condo for our traditional family dinner, a ritual we had kept since David's mother passed away. I sat at the head of the dining table, carving the roast beef, passing the salt, pouring the wine, smiling politely as Vanessa complained about how utterly exhausting her real estate conference in Seattle had been. I looked right into her lying eyes. I nodded sympathetically. I poured her more wine. It was the absolute hardest acting job of my entire life. If you have ever had to sit across a small table from someone you know for a fact is actively trying to destroy your family, you know the absolute psychological torture of keeping your mouth shut. It physically feels like swallowing broken glass and smiling while you bleed. Every time she reached over and affectionately touched my son's hand, a jolt of pure electrical rage shot up my spine, but I forced myself to look at David's tired, trusting, innocent face. I kept my mouth shut. When Victor finally called me back to his office, it was early December, and the city was covered in a thick, depressing layer of gray slush. I walked into his office, and he handed me a massive, 3-inch thick black binder that landed on the desk with a heavy thud. He looked exhausted, rubbing his eyes as he told me the man's name was Damien Thorne. Damien was a 44-year-old luxury landscape architect who relied entirely on high-end real estate agents like Vanessa to funnel wealthy clients into his failing firm. Damien was married, 12 years into a marriage with a woman named Rachel, who worked as an emergency room trauma surgeon at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. But the affair wasn't even the worst part of the file. Victor flipped the heavy binder open to the financial section, and my blood ran completely cold. Vanessa wasn't just sleeping with Damien in expensive hotels and remote cabins. She was actively, systematically funding his failing business with my son's money. Over the last 3.5 years, Vanessa had ruthlessly diverted nearly $90,000 from David's joint savings accounts and Mia's college fund. She had set up 3 dummy LLCs for home staging and design consulting, and routed the cash directly into Damien's commercial operating accounts. She had paid for the Door County wine. She had paid for the luxury hotel rooms in Cabo San Lucas. She was using my son's literal sweat and blood to finance her romantic fantasy life. I felt a cold, terrifying calm wash over me. I thanked Victor, paid his exorbitant invoice in cash, and walked out into the freezing wind with the binder under my arm. I walked straight down Michigan Avenue to the towering glass office building of Sylvia Vance, the most ruthless, terrifying family law attorney in Cook County. Sylvia was a predator in a designer suit who had cross-examined billionaire CEOs and made them openly weep on the witness stand. I sat in her plush leather chair and dropped the massive black binder directly onto her desk. She put on her reading glasses and spent a full, silent hour reading every single page. When she finally looked up, she took off her glasses. She smiled. It was a terrifying, bloodless smile. She leaned forward and told me that Illinois is an equitable distribution state, which means adultery alone rarely moves the needle in divorce court. She said judges don't care who sleeps with who. But dissipation of marital assets? Systematic financial fraud to fund an extramarital affair? That was a nuclear weapon. She explained that because Vanessa had stolen nearly 6 figures to fund her secret life, the family court would absolutely strip her of everything she valued. We could mathematically argue that Vanessa's profound dishonesty, financial recklessness, and blatant theft made her an entirely unfit primary parent. Sylvia told me that if we hit her with an emergency ex parte filing before she even knew we were coming, David would walk away with the primary residence, the retirement accounts, and full primary physical custody of his daughter. She told me to get David into her office by Friday afternoon. I agreed, but I had one more vital piece of business to handle before I blew my family's world apart. I couldn't stop thinking about Damien's wife, Rachel. I opened the file and stared at a surveillance photograph of her standing outside the hospital. She was wearing blue medical scrubs, holding a stale cup of cafeteria coffee with deep, dark circles under her exhausted eyes. She was literally saving human lives for 70 hours a week, standing covered in blood in the trauma bay, while her arrogant husband played house with my son's wife on my son's dime. It made me absolutely sick to my stomach. I remembered exactly what it felt like when my own wife was dying in that very same hospital. How utterly desperate I was for the doctors to just tell me the absolute truth about her failing prognosis, no matter how much it hurt. The truth is a heavy, crushing burden, but it is the only thing on earth that respects human dignity. I used my old corporate contacts to find Rachel's direct hospital extension. I called her from my secure line on a Wednesday afternoon. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice sounding rushed and clinical. I told her my full name. I told her I was holding 90 pages of irrefutable, completely documented evidence that her husband had been sleeping with my daughter-in-law for over 3 years. The line went completely, terrifyingly dead quiet. I could clearly hear the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and a muffled paging system somewhere in her background. She didn't scream. She didn't call me a liar. She asked me, in a voice that was barely a broken whisper, if I was absolutely sure. I told her I had high-resolution photographs of them at my private lake house. I told her I had the financial records showing my daughter-in-law was secretly paying off her husband's business debts. I told her I was emailing her a secure, encrypted link to the entire file right at this exact second. I told her I was breaking this devastating news to my son on Friday night, and I was calling her because I wanted her to have the exact same head start so neither Damien nor Vanessa could spin a web of lies to gaslight us. Rachel started to quietly cry. It wasn't a loud, dramatic sob. It was the fractured, ragged, awful sound of a strong woman realizing that the last 3 years of her reality were a deliberate hallucination. I sat in my armchair in the dark and stared at the ceiling. I listened to her weep. It broke my heart. After 2 full minutes, she finally stopped crying. When she spoke again, her voice had completely shifted. It became surgical. It became cold. She asked me exactly what time I was telling my son. I told her 6 o'clock sharp on Friday evening. She told me she finished her rotation at 5:30. She said Damien would be waiting at their townhouse in Lincoln Park. She promised me that at exactly 6 o'clock, she was going to walk through her front door and completely detonate his world. I hung up the phone. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself 2 fingers of scotch. I drank it in the dark. Friday night arrived with a brutal, howling snowstorm that paralyzed the city. David knocked on my condo door at exactly 6 o'clock. He came in stamping snow off his heavy leather boots, shaking out his wool scarf, complaining loudly about the terrible traffic on the Kennedy Expressway. He looked so incredibly young to me, in that single moment. He looked exactly like the little boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on the evening train. I told him to sit down at the heavy oak dining table. I didn't offer him a drink. I didn't try to soften the blow with small talk. I sat down directly across from him, looked him in the eyes, and pushed the massive black binder across the polished wood. I told him I loved him more than my own life. I told him Vanessa was having an affair. His face immediately froze. A nervous, highly confused laugh escaped his throat. He asked me if this was some kind of sick joke. I reached across the table and flipped the binder open. I showed him the photographs from the lake house. I watched his brown eyes rapidly track over the image of his wife wearing the silver necklace, leaning back against another man's chest. I watched the color completely drain from his face, leaving his skin the color of ash. His breathing turned incredibly shallow. He didn't scream. He didn't flip the table. He didn't throw a punch. He just stared at the glossy photographs as his entire universe collapsed inward on itself. Then I flipped past the photos to the financial section. I showed him the highlighted wire transfers. I showed him the dummy LLC documents. I showed him the $90,000 missing from his daughter's college fund and his own hard-earned retirement accounts. That was the kill shot. The betrayal of the body is one agonizing thing. The betrayal of the future, the theft of the safety you built for your child, is something else entirely. David covered his face with his trembling hands. He leaned his elbows heavily on the table. He let out a sound that I will absolutely never forget for as long as I live. It was the sound of a good man's soul tearing in half. I let him cry. I didn't touch him. I didn't offer empty, worthless platitudes about how time heals all wounds. I just sat there in the heavy silence and held the space for him to break. After 10 agonizing minutes, he finally looked up at me. His eyes were red, hollow, and ancient. He asked me what he was supposed to do now. I told him I had already packed a heavy duffel bag for him. I told him Mia was safely sleeping at my sister's house in the suburbs, completely protected from the blast radius. I told him Sylvia Vance had already drafted the emergency divorce and custody papers, and we were filing them in front of a judge at exactly 8 o'clock Monday morning. I told him that right at this exact second, a trauma surgeon named Rachel was confronting Damien across town, trapping them both in the truth. David realized, in that exact moment, the sheer, staggering magnitude of what I had orchestrated. He realized I had spent an entire month quietly walking through hell so I could pave a safe, illuminated road out for him. He slowly stood up from the chair. He walked over to my side of the table. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders and buried his face in my neck, crying quietly. He thanked me. We stayed like that for a very long time. At exactly 6:30, David's phone started violently buzzing on the table. It was Vanessa. She called him 14 times in a row, desperate, panicked, her world rapidly unraveling as Damien likely texted her in a sheer panic. David looked down at the glowing screen. He calmly reached down, turned the phone completely off, and dropped it into his coat pocket. The next 6 months were an absolute bloodbath in the Cook County family courts. Sylvia Vance was an apex predator in the courtroom. When Vanessa's overpriced lawyer tried to boldly claim that the lake house photos were an illegal invasion of privacy, Sylvia actually laughed out loud in the quiet courtroom. She smoothly reminded the judge that I exclusively owned the Door County property, that Vanessa was legally trespassing without my permission, and that I had every constitutional right to photograph an unknown trespasser on my own private land. The judge firmly agreed. When Vanessa took the witness stand, she tried desperately to play the victim, She tried to force tears. She talked about how lonely she was, how David worked too much, how she just wanted to feel seen. But when Sylvia relentlessly laid out the bank statements, line by excruciating line, showing how Vanessa bought her wealthy lover expensive dinners while David was working mandatory overtime to pay their mortgage, the judge's face turned to absolute stone. The judicial hammer fell incredibly hard. Because of the sheer scale of the financial theft, David was awarded full primary physical custody of Mia. Vanessa was granted every other weekend, highly supervised, with mandatory financial auditing. The property settlement was violently lopsided. The judge awarded David the marital home, the entirety of his retirement accounts, and forced Vanessa to take on all the remaining marital debt to offset the $90,000 she had stolen. She walked out of that courtroom with a single suitcase and a completely destroyed reputation. Damien's life disintegrated even faster than hers did. Rachel filed for a ruthless divorce the very next morning. She hired a forensic accountant of her own, who quickly discovered Damien had been committing massive federal tax fraud to hide the thousands of dollars Vanessa was funneling him. The IRS froze his commercial accounts. His business completely collapsed within weeks. Rachel kept their beautiful townhouse, all the assets, and her dignity. The last I heard from Victor, Damien was living in a cheap, depressing studio apartment in a terrible neighborhood, working hourly wages as a laborer for a landscaping company he used to compete with. Vanessa was forced to move into a cramped, noisy apartment with a stranger for a roommate. She is miserable. She is completely broke. She has to look her young daughter in the eye every other weekend and knows she traded her entire beautiful family for a cheap, temporary thrill that ended in ashes. It has been 2 years since that freezing, terrible afternoon in Door County. David is thriving. He was recently promoted to senior architectural partner at his firm. He met a wonderful, brilliant woman who teaches middle school English, and they are officially engaged to be married next spring. Mia is 9 years old now. She is happy, resilient, and deeply loved. She still sleeps in the exact same